A pilot took off with 8 passengers and crashed just 17 seconds later, killing everyone on board. And the reason why they crashed would shock everyone. But that's just one of the stories in today's video, because I'm about to share with you the 5 most reckless pilot mistakes that I've ever talked about on this channel, as well as a shocking bonus story about a deadly plane crash that I've never shared before. So sit back and get ready, because these aren't just pilot mistakes. In fact, I'd argue they were reckless decisions that pushed the limits, ignored the warnings, and got people killed. And even if these might sound familiar, the truth is that I've gone back and completely reworked these investigations so you can find out what really happened and the lessons that we can learn. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. The first story I want to share with you involved unqualified pilots operating what was likely an illegal flight without any regard for the safety of the passengers on board. And it all started when a couple named Marcy and Steve booked a private charter flight to go from St. Petersburg, Florida, up to Greenville, South Carolina to meet some friends. The pilot sitting in the left seat was John, and he had an airline transport pilot certificate with over 11,000 hours of total flight time. However, the only problem was that John only had a second in command rating for the aircraft he was flying, so there's no reason he should have been in the left seat and serving as the pilot in command for the flight. If you think that's bad, sitting next to John in the right seat was a man named Steve, who was the owner of the charter company that booked the flight. Steve had about 5,500 hours of total flight time, but he only had a private pilot certificate and he didn't have an instrument rating or any type ratings, so he wasn't qualified to operate the aircraft. The aircraft they were flying in was a Dassault Falcon 50. This is a 3-engine aircraft designed to be able to complete international flights but still maintain a short takeoff distance. However, the aircraft requires 2 fully qualified pilots to fly it, something that Steve and John should have known. Unfortunately, the story is only going to get worse, because the NTSB discovered that prior to the crash, the aircraft had been sitting in long-term storage for 4 years, and it was only recently pulled out of the hangar just 3 months before the tragedy. The reason this is a problem is because when the charter company did their initial inspections on the aircraft after they pulled it out of the hangar, they found over 100 discrepancies that needed to be fixed, and only about 60% of the work was complete at the time of the crash. So basically, the aircraft wasn't even airworthy and never should have flown at all. This is where it's worth pointing out that the director of maintenance was Tim, who was Steve's son. And when the NTSB found out that Steve had actually flown the aircraft 4 times prior to the crash, they asked Tim how his dad could fly the aircraft without him knowing about it, even though it was still being worked on. And Tim said, "He just does, and he doesn't tell me about it." All right, I realize there's a lot going on and we've gone through some of these details pretty quickly, but basically at this point we have a company booking passengers on flights in an aircraft that isn't airworthy, being flown by 2 pilots who aren't fully qualified to operate the aircraft, and the aircraft is being maintained by someone that doesn't know when the aircraft is being flown. However, we haven't even gotten to the worst part of the story. Even though this was allegedly a Part 135 flight because it was a private charter, according to court records, an individual had been recently hired to help Steve get the company's Part 135 status up and running again, and that person said the company didn't do any flights under Part 135 and everything was under Part 91. That means they can't legally charge passengers for flights. That being said, Tim, the director of maintenance, he told the investigators that he didn't know what kind of flights the company was conducting. Now, I can possibly understand that, but what I don't get is that Steve's other son, Travis, who was the manager of the flight school that Steve owned, he claimed that he didn't know the difference between Part 91 and Part 135, and he also said he had no idea that Marcy and her husband had paid over $100,000 for flights they had taken with the company. Now, as shocking as that might seem, we still need to talk about what happened during the flight. When it comes to the investigation, this is probably one of the shortest final reports that I've seen, considering everything that went wrong in this disaster. All we know for certain is that when they began their arrival into Greenville, that's when everything started to fall apart. Remember, you've got Steve in the right seat, not qualified to operate the aircraft, and John in the left seat, not qualified to act as the pilot in command for the flight. And by the way, just to clarify, they were flying into the Greenville downtown airport, not the Greenville Spartanburg airport that I think people might be more familiar with. and the weather was overcast at 3,100 feet, which is perfectly manageable and not a big threat for this flight. However, they're on an IFR flight plan and they have to get below the weather, so according to the cockpit voice recorder, the controller told them to expect the RNAV approach to runway 19. Even though this is a pretty simple approach, there's no evidence that John and Steve ever accomplished an approach briefing to talk about how to fly the approach or took the time to verify that the FMS was loaded correctly. Instead, when the controller started giving them vectors for the approach to runway 19, John and Steve set up the aircraft to fly the ILS to runway 01 going the opposite direction, and there wasn't any discussion in the cockpit about why they were doing that. 2 minutes later, the controller cleared them to fly direct to Dude, but they couldn't find where that was, so the controller gave them another heading and cleared them direct to Tyville, but they couldn't find that either, so the controller gave up and just started giving them vectors to final. A few minutes later, they were cleared for the approach, but the controller saw that their altitude was high, so he asked them if they were going to be able to make it down in time, and this is when John and Steve started to panic a little bit. You can tell from their responses that they probably didn't know how to fly the instrument approach. Instead, they were just hoping they could fly the approach visually, but the weather was getting in their way. Thankfully, at the last second, they found a hole in the clouds and dove down to get below the weather, but now the airport was only 5 miles away and they were running out of time. Unfortunately, the NTSB didn't provide any data related to the flight regarding their airspeed or altitude during the approach, so we have no idea how fast they were going or if they were stabilized on final. Regardless, I'm sure that Marcy and her husband were sitting in the back with no idea what was about to happen. As soon as they touched down, John applied the thrust reversers, but the aircraft wasn't slowing down. John yelled out, "Where are the brakes? I have no brakes. Where are the brakes?" Then he yelled at Steve to get on the brakes, but Steve just sat there and didn't respond as they were screaming down the runway. John kept yelling at Steve, and 22 seconds after they touched down, the only thing that Steve said was, "No brakes." This is where you need to remember that there are emergency procedures for when the brakes aren't working, but John didn't do any of those steps in the checklist, and therefore the aircraft went off the end of the runway and crashed down a hill. And tragically, because John and Steve weren't wearing their restraints, it killed them both instantly. Now, as messed up as this story was, I'd argue that the most reckless part about all of this was that if you remember from earlier, Steve had flown the plane with another pilot 4 times prior to the crash. Well, that other pilot, he told the NTSB that the brakes had failed on all 4 of those flights, and even though maintenance put an inoperative sticker near the brake switch, John somehow had no idea that the brakes weren't working, and there's no evidence that Steve ever warned him to be prepared for the brakes to fail when he landed. The only good part of the story is that somehow Marcy and her husband managed to survive in the back of the plane, but unfortunately the passengers in our next story wouldn't be as lucky. Our next story about a reckless pilot mistake is one that was caught on camera, and it involved a King Air 350 that took off, and the co-pilot yelled out, "You just lost your left engine." The aircraft rolled to the left and crashed nearly inverted just 17 seconds after takeoff, killing 10 people on board instantly, including a family of 4. But the shocking truth is that there was nothing wrong with the left engine. In order to understand the reason why they crashed, we have to go back to the beginning when 2 pilots were getting their King Air 350 ready to take 8 passengers from Addison, Texas to St. Petersburg, Florida. The King Air 350 is a very popular twin turboprop, and even though you only need 1 pilot to fly it, it's not uncommon to have a second pilot on board to help with the checklist, the radios, and the passengers. That being said, Howard was the pilot flying the plane, and because he was 71 years old, he always felt more comfortable taking a second pilot with him on trips like this. Howard had over 16,000 hours of total flight time, with 1,100 hours in the King Air 350. Additionally, he had just completed his recurrent training about 3 months prior to the crash, where his instructor said that he performed well on the simulated single engine failure on takeoff. However, when it comes to Howard's training, the engine failure scenario was done in the aircraft at a safe altitude and configuration, which is never going to give you the same experience as losing an engine on takeoff. The other pilot flying with Howard was Matthew, and he was 28 years old and he had just over 2,300 hours of total flight time, but he was not qualified to operate the controls of the King Air 350. However, there's nothing wrong with that because remember, he's just there to be a safety observer and he had plenty of experience and was described as a very strong co-pilot. Now, when it comes to the flight, Matt greeted the passengers about 90 minutes before departure and loaded their luggage on the plane, but according to witnesses, none of the bags were weighed. And in my opinion, this was one of the first reckless mistakes they made. The reason why is because all 4 of their fuel tanks were filled with 329 gallons of fuel, and they had a full load with 8 passengers on board. That meant they should have been thinking about their max allowable takeoff weight, but my guess is that Matt probably just assumed that Howard knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, the NTSB determined that the aircraft was about 600 pounds over the max allowable takeoff weight. But what's surprising to me is that they also determined, despite the extra weight, the aircraft rate of climb on takeoff was about normal, and this isn't what caused them to crash. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean it's acceptable to take off when you're overweight, because there's a reason why the manufacturer specifies a limit, and if you exceed it, you're taking a risk that could get you killed. Now, going back to the investigation, one of the most helpful pieces of evidence for this tragedy was the cockpit voice recorder, and I want you to pay very close attention to the timeline for the events that happened during this flight, because even though the NTSB didn't really talk about this, I think it played a role in what happened. At 8:59 a.m., Matt saw the passengers walking out towards the plane, and they had planned on a 9 a.m. departure. And at 9:02 a.m., Howard was telling them to get their butts in their seats so they can go, and 1 minute later, he was starting the first engine. However, he didn't give a safety briefing to the passengers, and there was no evidence of a pre-flight or a before-start checklist being accomplished. Instead, about 15 seconds after the first engine is started, they got the second engine running, and then nothing else was heard in the cockpit until 2 minutes later at 9:05 a.m. when Matt called to get clearance to taxi. As they taxied out to the runway, there was no discussion about emergencies on takeoff, no departure briefing, and they didn't do an after start or a before takeoff checklist. They just taxied out mostly in silence, and the controller asked if they were going to be ready to go when they got to the end of the runway. Now, I want to pause for just a second here because you need to understand that there's a reason why we have checklists. You might not realize it, but a lot of the emergency procedures and the warnings that are in the checklist are written in blood. And that's why I don't care how many flight hours you have or how much experience you have, you need to take the time to get your checklist out and use it. And what's frustrating about this tragedy is that this sort of behavior was probably normal for Howard because his former business partner said Howard was always impressed with pilots that could hop in a plane and take off with minimal use of the checklist. Additionally, another pilot that flew with Howard described him as an old cantankerous captain that didn't like to use the checklist and would just jump in the airplane and go. Just for the record, it was only about 7 minutes from the time the second engine was started until the time they applied takeoff power, so everything felt very rushed even though it didn't need to be, and I wish they had taken just a few more minutes to knock out the checklist, because as soon as Howard applied the takeoff power, that's when everything started to fall apart. Matt called out airspeeds alive, meaning the airspeed indicator was working, and then about 10 seconds later, Howard pulled back on the controls to rotate, and they started to climb away from the ground. Just 6 seconds later, Howard said, "What in the world?" and the stall warning horn went off. That's when Matt yelled out, "You just lost your left engine." For the next 8 seconds, all you can hear is the stall warning horn and the bank angle warning going off until the aircraft impacted a hangar on the airfield just 17 seconds after becoming airborne, killing everyone on board instantly. Alright, remember when I told you earlier that they didn't lose the left engine? Well, let me explain what really happened. You see, even though Matt said airspeeds alive, he never called out any other airspeeds or said anything else during the takeoff roll. And this is something that I talked about in the recent video I made about Air India 171 when I went over the speeds that multi-engine pilots are looking for on takeoff. So watch that video if you want a refresher. But basically you have V1, which is your takeoff decision speed. Then you have VR, which is your rotation speed. And then V2, which is your takeoff safety speed, or the speed that you climb out at with one engine inoperative. According to the investigation, V1 was 106 knots, VR was 110, and V2 was 117. Now, I'm not sure what Howard expected out of Matt, but he could have briefed for him to call out V1 and rotate to help back him up, because unfortunately, Howard rotated early at 102 knots or 8 knots below rotation speed. Even though the aircraft can still get airborne at a slower speed, it decreases your margin of safety and puts you very close to the minimum controllable airspeed for the aircraft, which means you have very little time to react. However, what made the situation worse is that Howard pulled back quickly on the controls to try and perform a steep takeoff, essentially showboating, and when he did that, it caused a big problem. This is where you need to know that the King Air 350 that Howard was flying can sometimes experience something called power lever migration, and that's when the power levers roll back on their own if the throttle friction isn't set for takeoff. And this is the reason why we have checklists, because the truth is that the before takeoff checklist tells you to check the throttle friction, something that Howard probably forgot to do. Either way, when he pulled back sharply on the controls, the power lever on the left engine rolled back, and Matt immediately assumed that it was a left engine failure because no one bothered to look at the throttles. Now, in a situation like this, my guess is that the sudden loss of thrust caught Howard completely off guard. And considering that he didn't practice something as drastic as this in the simulator, he probably wasn't prepared for how to handle it. And that's why I think the biggest mistake he made, which was the one that ultimately caused him to lose control of the aircraft, was that he immediately applied full left rudder when they lost thrust on the left engine. That's the exact opposite of what you want to do in a situation like this, and it just made the aircraft roll to the left even faster. And even though Howard quickly realized his mistake and tried to apply right rudder, it was too late, and 10 people were killed when they crashed into the hangar. The NTSB said the probable cause was Howard's failure to maintain aircraft control, but I'd argue that the root cause of this tragedy was Howard's decision not to use the checklist and some of the hazardous attitudes that he demonstrated leading up to this tragedy. There's simply no room for ego in the cockpit, and that's a lesson the pilots in our next story had to learn the hard way. The next story on our list about a reckless pilot mistake takes us back to Greenville, South Carolina, when 2 pilots on a private charter flight tried to race another airplane, and the ending didn't turn out the way they planned. This story begins in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, where the pilots flew a Gulfstream 150 to pick up 3 passengers for the flight to South Carolina. If you're not familiar with this aircraft, the G150 is known as one of the fastest mid-sized business jets in the world, which is probably something that played a role in this crash. We don't know much about the pilots other than Greg was the pilot sitting in the left seat and he had over 9,000 hours of total time, but only about 100 hours of experience in the G150, and Bo was the pilot sitting next to him in the right seat, and Bo had about 1,500 hours of total time, but only 32 hours of experience in the aircraft. So right from the start, you've got 2 pilots who seem to have a lot of experience, but they're both very new to the aircraft, and because of that, I don't think they should have been flying together. Either way, when it comes to the flight, the passengers were running a little bit late, so the flight was behind schedule. And that's probably why shortly after takeoff, one of the passengers asked Greg what time they were going to get there, and Greg said, "I'll speed up and I'll go real fast." Unfortunately, in this case, Greg decided that he wanted to make it a race to get to the destination as fast as possible, and he told Bo, "I'm already letting it roll," and Bo's response was, "Yeah, we're doing 300 knots at 9,000 feet. The reason that's an issue is because they're not supposed to be going faster than 250 knots when they're below 10,000 feet. However, because the NTSB didn't really talk about this, I think it's worth pointing out that when I looked at their flight data, they were doing about 300 knots from just a few minutes after takeoff when they were only at 3,000 feet, and they were actually going closer to 350 knots by the time they got to 10,000 feet. That means that Greg was most likely already breaking the airspeed rules before the passenger even asked him what time they would get there. That being said, according to the cockpit voice recorder, allegedly the passenger had a history of challenging Greg to see how fast he could get them to their destination, and one time when the flight was going to be 40 minutes, the passenger challenged him to do it in 39, and Greg will go on to say that it's okay to break the rules because the passenger is the one asking for it, and that's the whole reason the passenger owns the jet. Look, that's not how this works. Your number one priority as a pilot is the safety of everyone on board the aircraft, not doing whatever the passenger tells you to do. Either way, at some point during the flight, Greg realized there was another plane headed to the same airport as they were that was about 2 minutes ahead of them. So he told Bo, look, this other plane is going to slow down to 250 knots below 10,000 feet, but we won't because we're trying to win a race. They both laughed, and Greg said, this is NASCAR. Over the next 10 minutes, as they were getting ready for the arrival, there's no evidence they ever conducted an approach briefing to talk about the airport, the weather, what runway they're going to land on, or the type of approach they were going to fly. Now, maybe that's because they assumed it would be clear skies and they'd fly a visual approach, but still, you have to talk about these things, and you're going to find out why in just a minute. For right now, the controller cleared them down to 11,000 feet, and as they were descending, they got an overspeed warning for about 8 seconds, trying to warn them they were exceeding the manufacturer's limits for the aircraft. However, Greg joked about it, saying, goal achieved. You saw that. I achieved the goal. And now Bo was cheering him on, saying they're on their final lap. Eventually, they had the airport in sight, and the controller cleared them down to 2,000 feet. About 30 seconds later, they got another overspeed warning, this time for 11 seconds, and then it stopped for a moment and resumed for another 15 seconds as they pushed the limits of the aircraft to go as fast as they possibly could. This is where it's important to understand that Greg and Bo needed about 3,000 feet to land and come to a stop, and considering the runway was only 4,200 feet long, they didn't have a lot of margin for error. The reason this is such a big deal is because Greg and Bo didn't fully take into consideration the winds. That's because the airport they were landing at didn't have a weather reporting capability, so they relied on a nearby airfield observation that indicated the winds were 2-0 at 3 knots. And because they were planning to land on runway 36, that meant they'd have a slight quartering tailwind upon landing, and they should have considered landing on runway 18 so that way they'd have a headwind. Unfortunately, that never happened, and the truth is that if you look at the windsock in the video, the winds were actually much worse, and they had a 10 to 15 knot tailwind when they landed on runway 36. This is obviously going to increase their landing distance quite a bit, but more importantly, it's more than the 10 knot tailwind limit of the aircraft they were flying. Now, just for comparison, this is what a normal landing is supposed to look like, because this is a video of the exact same aircraft landing on the exact same runway just a few months prior to the mishap. You're going to see them touch down pretty quickly, but pay attention to how fast they come to a stop, and you're also going to see and hear the thrust reversers in action. That video proved that it was easily possible to land the aircraft and slow down to a safe taxi speed, and they were even able to exit the runway when they were about 1,000 feet from the end. Unfortunately, Greg and Bo had a different result with their landing. According to the investigation, when they were about 5 miles out, they disconnected the autopilot, but the problem is they were still going too fast. And for the first time, Bo finally spoke up and asked, should we S-turn this thing? To try and give them time to slow down, but Greg said, nah, we got it. The last data point we have from the flight shows that they were doing about 190 knots ground speed, and they were 975 feet above the ground when they were 1.5 miles from the end of the runway. That would have been the perfect time to perform a go-around because this is definitely not a stabilized approach. In fact, their calculated landing speed was 121 knots. So what they're trying to do is dive down and slow down at the same time, something that's not going to happen very easily. And that's why for the rest of the approach, they're going to get multiple sink rate and pull up warnings. According to the transcript, somehow they got down to 130 knots. So they were only about 10 knots fast just before they touched down on the runway. Now let's look at the video to see if you can spot what went wrong compared to the clip that we saw earlier, and then I'll explain what really happened. According to the NTSB, as soon as they landed, the thrust reversers deployed within 2 seconds, and Greg started applying the brakes. But Bo didn't think they were slowing down fast enough, so he asked if he should step on the brakes too, but that didn't seem to help either. At that point, they both assumed that the thrust reversers and the brakes weren't working, but the truth is that they were working fine. They were just going too fast. In fact, it turned out they weren't pressing hard enough on the brakes because the skid marks from the tires didn't even show up on the runway until they were about 1,000 feet from the end. What made the situation worse was this switch right here for the ground air brakes. It's supposed to be in the land position just like you see it here, and that way the air brakes will automatically deploy when you land. But for some reason that never happened as soon as they touched down on the runway. The NTSB determined there was nothing wrong with the air brakes or anything else on the aircraft, so no one knows what really happened. Either way, the NTSB said the probable cause was an unstable approach and the failure of the air brakes to deploy, but I'd argue it was the reckless mistakes involved with trying to race another aircraft, failing to prepare for the approach, and deliberately violating the rules and procedures designed to keep you safe. Now, you might be glad to hear that despite the mistakes that were made during the flight, the truth is everyone survived the crash. Unfortunately, the next story that I'm about to share with you had a much more tragic ending. The next reckless mistake that we need to talk about was caught on camera as bystanders watched in horror as an aircraft accelerated down the runway and tried to take off during the middle of a snowstorm. It disappeared into the clouds and crashed just a few seconds later, less than a mile from the airport, killing 9 of the 12 family members on board the plane, including the pilot. This was supposed to be a fun trip to go hunting together for the Thanksgiving holiday, but it turned into a deadly disaster and 4 generations of a family were gone. Kirk was the pilot flying the plane, and he had all the necessary ratings with over 2,300 hours of total flight time, including over 1,200 hours in the aircraft he was flying, which was a 2013 Pilatus PC-12. If you're not familiar with this aircraft, it's a single-engine turboprop with a pressurized cabin known for its short takeoff and landing capabilities, but the main thing you need to know is that it has a stick shaker and stick pusher system that's supposed to help you avoid or recover from a stall. The way the system works is the control wheel is going to shake when you're about to stall, and if you ignore the warning, then the stick pusher will move the controls forward to reduce the angle of attack to try and prevent the stall. Keep that in mind for later when we talk about what happened during the flight. However, before we get to that, the truth is that this story began when Kirk and his family boarded the plane in Idaho to start their trip to the Chamberlain Airport in South Dakota. And I think one of the first reckless mistakes he made was overloading the aircraft. Even though the aircraft only had 10 seats available, including the 2 in the cockpit, there were 12 people on board the plane, and that means 2 passengers were sitting on the floor, most likely the 2 smallest children. There's a bunch of reasons why this is a terrible idea, but one of the biggest issues was that it meant they were about 107 pounds over the approved maximum gross weight of the aircraft, and the center of gravity was about 3 to 5.5 inches beyond the aft CG limit. This meant the aircraft was tail heavy and it was going to be harder to control, which would turn out to be a contributing factor to the crash. Fortunately, the flight to South Dakota was relatively uneventful, and Kirk landed at the Chamberlain Airport around 9:30 in the morning, but there wasn't any hangar space for the aircraft, so they had to leave it parked on the ramp. The reason this was a problem was because there was a winter storm moving through the area that evening, and Kirk and the family had planned to fly home the next day. Now, my guess is that Kirk probably had checked the weather ahead of time and knew about the storm. After all, they were going to be outside hunting. Either way, when he showed up at the airport the next morning to get everything ready, he discovered the aircraft was covered with about 2 inches of snow and freezing drizzle. That might not seem like a big deal, but the airport facility didn't have any de-icing capabilities, so the best decision would have been to rent some cars and drive home, or wait until the ice melted off the plane, or maybe even stay an extra day or two. But Kirk didn't do that. Instead, he drove back to the lodge where they were staying, and he borrowed a 7-foot ladder, and then he went to a local hardware store and bought some isopropyl alcohol to try and de-ice the aircraft himself. Kirk and another family member spent the next 3 hours trying to get the snow and ice off the aircraft, and this photo was taken after they had already been working on it for almost 2 hours. And the biggest challenge was that there was no way for them to reach the control surfaces on the tail of the aircraft since they only had a 7-foot ladder, so they never de-iced those surfaces. Now remember that the aircraft was already 107 pounds overweight with an aft center of gravity, but that didn't include the weight of all the ice and snow on the tail, which was going to make the situation worse. About 30 minutes before takeoff, Kirk checked the weather conditions for the airfield, but there's no evidence that he bothered to get an update on the winter storm that had blown through the area. If he did, he would have learned there was an AirMet warning pilots about moderate turbulence, moderate icing, and IFR conditions, and he also would have learned about the winter weather warning with snow and winds gusting up to 40 miles an hour until noon that day. Seemingly unaware of the dangerous conditions, Kirk got everyone loaded up in the aircraft, and by the time he started the engines, the ceiling was overcast at 500 feet with 3/4 of a mile visibility due to light snow, and the temperature and dew point were both 1 degree Celsius. That meant there was a good chance they could be flying through some freezing fog, and these are not the kind of conditions to mess around with as a pilot. And basically, by this point, there had been multiple warning signs telling Kirk that it wasn't a good idea to fly. Unfortunately, we still haven't gotten to the worst part of the story. As Kirk was getting ready to taxi, he made a radio call saying that he was going to back taxi to runway 31. Now you can see in this video when they taxi out how bad the weather was, and the airport manager watched all this and he was shocked that Kirk would try and take off, and he told Kirk, "It don't look good to me. I don't know what you guys are thinking." Unfortunately, Kirk just ignored him and asked if the runway was in good condition, and the airfield manager responded saying that he can't hardly keep up with all the snow, meaning that he couldn't plow the runway fast enough to keep it clear. That would have been the perfect time for Kirk to say, "You know what, this is probably a bad idea. We're going to go ahead and shut down and come up with another plan." But instead, he just said, "All right, I'll be okay." And just to show you how focused Kirk was on trying to make the flight happen, in the middle of the back and forth on the radio, he complained to one of the passengers that he could have had the runway cleared in 30 minutes if he was doing it himself. In a last-ditch effort, the airfield manager tried to stop Kirk, saying, "You guys are crazy. I got berms on this thing. I got to get the snow out of here." And he told Kirk again that it didn't look good to him. However, despite all the warnings, Kirk lined up at the end of the runway for takeoff, and there wasn't anything that could stop what was about to happen next. Now, without getting into all the technical details, what you need to know is that Kirk had the propeller heat and de-ice turned on, and that meant that the aircraft's stick shaker and pusher system that I talked about earlier, it was in the pusher ice mode. That's going to result in stall warnings at higher airspeeds and lower angles of attack because the aircraft assumes there's ice on the control surfaces, so it wants to give you that extra margin of safety. Now that might sound good, but as a pilot you have to account for that, which means you need to increase your takeoff rotation speed from 82 to 92 knots because the stall warnings are going to happen around 87 knots. Either Kirk didn't know about this or he didn't account for it because he started his rotation at 88 knots, and as a result, the stick shaker activated about 1 second after they got airborne. When the NTSB analyzed the data for the flight, they discovered that most PC-12 pilots rotate on takeoff at about 3 degrees per second to an initial pitch angle of 5 degrees before gradually increasing that to the 9-degree flight director target. However, Kirk's takeoff involved a quick and heavy pull on the control wheel with a rotation of about 4.3 degrees per second and an initial pitch angle above the 9-degree flight director target. Essentially, it was very aggressive and more than the aircraft was capable of, and despite the stick shaker warning him of the stall, he continued to pull back on the controls, and the more he pulled, the slower they got. Almost immediately, the stick pusher activated and the system tried to save them from a stall by pushing the controls forward, but as soon as the stick shaker stopped, Kirk would pull back on the controls again, repeating the cycle and making things worse until eventually they entered a deep stall, rolled to the left, and crashed. The NTSB said they crashed because they stalled on takeoff, but I'd argue the root cause of this tragedy was a series of reckless mistakes that all started with the plan and getting into a situation where Kirk likely felt pressured to make the flight happen. That being said, the mistakes he made were nothing compared to what you're going to hear about in one of the tragedies coming up. But before we get to that, I have a special bonus for you, and it's a short story about a pilot's reckless mistakes that I've never shared on this channel before. This was all that was left of the wreckage after two pilots made several reckless decisions and crashed, killing everyone on board. But to understand how something like this could happen, we have to go back to June of 2019 when a man living in Texas decided to purchase a 1968 Cessna 421 Golden Eagle with the goal of flipping it to a new owner after making some repairs. Now that seemed pretty reasonable, but one of the biggest issues was that the aircraft was located down in Florida and it hadn't been flown regularly in years, and the last documented annual inspection was in February 2014, more than 5 years before the purchase. That's why the new owner hired a local mechanic to do a full inspection and get the aircraft flying again. During that inspection, they discovered that the left engine tachometer and the fuel gauges were inoperative, along with a few other items that needed to be repaired or replaced. This wasn't a big deal, and the mechanic said he could take care of everything, and as a favor, he would also find a ferry pilot to transport the aircraft to Texas for the owner when all the work was done. So far, everything seemed to be going according to plan, but unfortunately, the owner wasn't aware of what was going on behind the scenes. You see, the mechanic ended up hiring a 32-year-old pilot named Andrew to fly the plane, but the problem was that Andrew only had a private pilot certificate with a rating for single-engine aircraft with about 155 hours of total flight time. So there's no reason why Andrew should have agreed to the job, and what's worse is that according to the investigation, there was no evidence that Andrew had ever even flown in a multi-engine aircraft before. Keep in mind that none of this was discussed with the owner, so he had no idea what was about to happen, and here's where things start to get interesting. That's because before the mechanic could finish completing the work, Andrew and two friends decided to hop in the plane and take it for a flight. One of those friends was actually a pilot named Armand, and Armand had a commercial pilot certificate with a multi-engine rating. But according to his logbook, he only had about 500 hours of total flight time and 40 hours in multi-engine aircraft, and he didn't have any experience flying a Cessna 421, nor did he have an endorsement to fly complex aircraft. Now, I'm not sure if Armand lied to Andrew or what was going on, but I think it's possible that Andrew took the job thinking that he could get Armand to fly the plane with him and they could split the money. But that's entirely speculation on my part, and the truth is we don't know why the two of them decided to take off in an aircraft that neither of them were qualified to fly, while the aircraft was still undergoing repairs and wasn't even airworthy. To make matters worse, their other friend Shauna wasn't a pilot and she was just along for the ride, and she most likely trusted Armand and Andrew to keep her safe. The investigation provided very little details about the flight because the truth is no one saw them take off and there wasn't any ADS-B or radar data to figure out what happened during the flight. All we know for certain is a witness near the crash site heard them flying overhead and said that the engine sounded rough, and another witness saw the plane at about 1,000 feet and banking to the left, and he said the engine seemed to be running at low idle, and eventually he watched the aircraft roll to the left 3 times before crashing into the woods, killing everyone on board instantly. Eventually, the NTSB determined that there was nothing wrong with the aircraft that might have caused it to crash, and they blamed the pilot for taking off in a plane that he wasn't qualified to fly, nor did he have permission to fly. However, a possible contributing factor was that during the autopsy, they discovered THC in the pilot's blood samples, which might have impaired his decision-making. But now that you know what really happened in this tragedy, it's time to talk about what's probably the most reckless pilot mistake story that I've ever shared on this channel. 4 teenagers and 2 adults boarded an aircraft after a fun weekend of hunting for what was supposed to be a routine flight from the Hyde County Airport, North Carolina, to head down the coast to the Michael J. Smith Airport. Everything seemed to be going fine until all of a sudden, about 30 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft banked sharply to the right and crashed into the ocean, killing everyone on board instantly. Ernest was 67 years old and he was the pilot flying the plane. He had about 3,000 hours of total flight time with a commercial certificate and an instrument rating. One of the possible factors in this tragedy was that Ernest had a history of back pain and he had self-reported taking oxycodone. He also had COVID a few weeks prior to the crash and still had a lingering cough. If that wasn't bad enough, one of the other possible distractions on the flight was the fact that Ernest decided to take his son Jeffrey with him. Jeff was a student pilot with about 100 hours of flight time, including 21 hours in the make and model they crashed. The reason why this matters is because Ernest was essentially using the flight to try and teach his son how to fly, but he would also end up relying on his son to help him throughout the entire flight. The aircraft they were flying in was a 2017 Pilatus PC-12. And unlike the last PC-12 tragedy that we talked about, this one was within the weight and balance limits for the flight. Now, we previously talked about the stick shaker and pusher system on the PC-12, so I won't explain that again, but one of the aircraft systems that I haven't talked about yet is the autopilot. That's a great tool to help you out, but only if you know what it's doing, which will turn out to be a factor in this tragedy. For right now, what you need to understand is that about 5 hours before the flight, Ernest got out his iPad and he checked the weather. Hyde County, where they took off from, was reporting overcast at 2,100 feet, and their destination was overcast at 1,000. However, there were also clouds along the coast as low as 600 feet to as high as 25,000 feet. This meant Ernest should have filed an IFR flight plan, and he also should have filed an alternate destination airport for the trip. However, he didn't do either of those, and he also never bothered to get any weather updates before they took off. And my guess is he probably assumed he could just fly VFR at 500 feet down the coast, but you're about to find out why that was a reckless mistake. While Ernest was finishing up the pre-flight, he told his son to put 3,500 feet in the system for their initial altitude after takeoff. However, considering the clouds were overcast at 2,100 feet, this didn't make any sense because that would put them in the weather, something you're not allowed to do on a VFR flight. Next, he asked his son to put in Whiskey 95 on the flight plan. That's Ocracoke Island, and the reason he wanted to fly over that airfield is because it's going to help him remain clear of R-5306, which is the restricted airspace along the coast. Unfortunately, Jeff couldn't figure out how to do it, but instead of taking the time to teach him, Ernest said that they would get it later. As they got ready to take off, Ernest let his son taxi the plane out to the runway, and I just want to go ahead and point out that there was no evidence they did any sort of checklist before they took off. A few minutes after they got airborne, Ernest asked his son again to put in Whiskey 95 in the navigation system, but this time his son ended up putting in 7 Whiskey 6, which is the identifier for the airfield they just took off from, and that's when everything started to fall apart because now they had no idea where they were going. As Ernest and his son tried to figure out the flight plan, Ernest kept climbing straight ahead to an altitude of about 3,500 feet. Even though he's supposed to remain VFR, my guess is at this point he was in the weather. That's because if he was VFR, he could have just looked outside and turned to the east and pointed towards Ocracoke Island, but that never happened, and instead he flew straight ahead. That's when he finally called Cherry Point Approach on the radio, but instead of asking for an IFR clearance, he requested VFR flight following, perhaps afraid to admit that he had flown into the weather. The controller tried to warn him that R-5306 was active, but Ernest cut him off to say that they were going to remain clear of it to the east. The only problem was Ernest still couldn't figure out what was going on with their flight plan, and his son wasn't very much help either. That's when the controller asked Ernest to contact him on a new frequency, and even though Ernest read it back correctly, he put the wrong frequency in the radio and he never got a hold of the controller. Instead, he flew straight ahead right into the restricted area. About 3 minutes later, Ernest finally realized that he screwed up, so he made a U-turn, but by now he had gotten so distracted by the situation that he descended 500 feet and started getting speed warnings from the aircraft, probably because they were exceeding 250 knots below 10,000 feet. Ernest and his son spent the next several minutes trying to figure out the aircraft navigation system, and they also checked the ATIS broadcast to get an update on the weather. That's when they learned that their destination was reporting overcast at 1,000 feet, and I think that's the moment that Ernest finally realized he was in big trouble. He was in the weather on a VFR flight plan, not talking to anyone, and he probably had no clue how he was going to get below the weather to land. And to make matters worse, when they got that speed warning a few minutes ago, Ernest had pulled the power back to slow down, but he was so distracted that he forgot about the power setting, and the airspeed decreased from 250 down to about 150 knots over a 4-minute period, where it would remain for almost the rest of the flight. This is where things really started to spiral out of control, and that's because Ernest realized he was going to have to fly the RNAV approach to runway 26 to get below the weather, so he called the controller, and that's when he finally realized he was on the wrong radio frequency. He He was able to fix that and got a hold of the controller, but then he was told that approach wasn't possible because it went right through the restricted airspace, which was still active, so the controller offered him an approach to runway 8 instead. If things weren't bad enough, while Ernest was scrambling to get set up for the approach to runway 8, the controller called him back to let him know that the restricted area was no longer active, so he could have the approach to runway 26 like he originally requested. Keep in mind that Ernest was most likely in the weather this entire time, which can be very disorienting, especially if your head's down trying to figure out how to load the approach into the aircraft navigation system, which is essentially what Ernest would be doing for the rest of the entire flight. Now, there's a lot more I could say about this because the cockpit voice recorder transcript is over 70 pages long, and it's one of the most shocking things that I've ever seen. But basically, they eventually got cleared down to 1,900 feet, and they were cleared for the approach. However, Ernest selected 1,800 feet for the autopilot altitude, and he pulled the power back even further so he wouldn't get fast in the descent. Unfortunately, once again, he never increased the power when they leveled off at 1,800 feet, so they started to lose about 1 knot per second as the autopilot slowly increased the pitch of the nose to try and maintain level flight. The controller eventually noticed that Ernest wasn't at 1,900 feet, so he reminded him again and gave him an altimeter setting, but Ernest's response would end up being the last radio call he would make. 15 seconds later, the airspeed had decreased to 93 knots and the aircraft pitch angle was 10 degrees nose high. The stall warning sounded and the stick shaker activated, and now they only had about 2 minutes left to live. The autopilot disengaged and Ernest increased the engine power, but instead of flying the aircraft first and recovering from the stall warning, he tried messing around with the flight computer, saying things like heading and navigate, perhaps hoping that the autopilot would fix everything. My guess is Ernest was completely disoriented at this point, and even though the stick shaker and stick pusher kept activating, Ernest kept fighting it, pulling back on the controls as the aircraft got almost 32 degrees nose high and as slow as 83 knots. About 1 minute after the initial stall indications, Ernest was still fighting the system as he yelled, "Navigate, navigate." 10 more seconds went by and he yelled out, "Activate vectors." Another 10 seconds. "Now I've got to get back over here to Seagore." The aircraft got as high as 4,700 feet in a climbing turn before it stalled and rolled more than 90 degrees to the right and pitched 50 degrees nose down. They slammed into the ocean a few seconds later, killing everyone on board instantly. There's no excuse for what happened during this flight. If Ernest had spent 5 to 10 minutes on the ground checking the weather, filing an IFR flight plan, and loading everything into the aircraft navigation system, this tragedy might have been prevented. Instead, he got disoriented while he was flying in the weather because he was so distracted trying to figure out the autopilot in the navigation system, and he lost control of the aircraft, and 8 lives were lost, and a wrongful death lawsuit was settled for $15 million. This was a series of terrible tragedies, and I know it might seem easy to go back and talk about all the mistakes that were made during these flights, but the truth is it's not easy. We're talking about real people whose lives were lost, and their friends and family members still have to deal with that every single day. The point of the debrief isn't to cast blame or ridicule the pilots for the mistakes they made. It's to focus on the facts and identify the root cause of these tragedies, even if we discover that the mistakes they made were somewhat reckless. To be perfectly honest, I guarantee that everyone that knows these pilots probably wishes they had an opportunity to sit down with them before these tragedies and talk to them about some of the things they were doing that could get themselves killed. That's the point of the debrief. It's about saving lives, and I hope you found some value in hearing these lessons. And if you want to go back and watch the full version of these stories, I've included links in the video description below, or you can watch the full playlist on the screen here. And thank you so much for your support, especially to the folks on Patreon for helping make content like this possible.